the link between the problem of the will, the birth, the origin of the problem of will, the beginning of the problem of will, in its connection to the problem of potentiality. I hope it's clear in that passage. And if you have any question about the problem of the potentiality, of course, you can ask. What I will do now is to go on the problem of how Christian theology really invented and developed in some way the concept of will, the modern concept of will. But we will see, I will make perhaps 3 examples, and in each of these examples you will see that the concept of will is introduced and developed each time in order to cope with an aporia, a difficulty, a problem concerning potentiality. In a different way, not in the same way we saw in Aristotle, in a different perspective, in a different context, but always what we have to do is to introduce will as in order to cope with the problem of potentiality. And not only with a problem like in Aristotle, often in order to modify, to act on the concept of potentiality, to transform the concept of potentiality in something different. So, in the first of these examples, for instance, we will see how what is at stake is to split potentiality and actuality. And we will see the problem of will arise from this splitting. So there is something which is impeding the transition from potentiality and actuality, which is separating what you can from what you can do, from potentiality from actuality, and there the concept of will is introduced. This important point, this concept of the relationship between potentiality and actuality, because in Aristotle they are clearly distinguished, as we saw, but they are never separated. Though potentiality exists in some way in itself, especially in the form of the potentiality not to pass to the act, but then the essential link between potentiality and actuality is always kept. While what we'll see here is a moment when we see a man having to cope with the problem of an interior splitting between what he can and what he does. And then we will see the will appear. So we are going to read a famous important passage from the letter of Paul to the Romans, so one of the founding texts of Christianity. So it's the letter to the Romans 7:7. It's a text which is often quoted to show how Christianity invented the concept of will. But we will see it's not really the case, and that what we see in the text is, on the contrary, yes, we see the will arise and appear, but will appears, originates from a division of potentiality. Splitting of potentiality, what you can, with respect to the passage to the act. There is a kind of breaking of the relation between the two. And there appears the concept of will. So, of course, you can imagine this passage has been commented 1,000 times, even by, we will see, Augustine. And this passage which concerns the whole critiques of the law, of the Torah, of the Jewish Torah. As you know, Paul is a messianic thinker, and according to Jewish messianism, the coming of the Messiah coincides with a critique, a disactivation, or even an abolition of the law. The coming of Messiah, Paul will even write, is the telos, the end of the law. If you are familiar with the importance of the law in the Jewish tradition, you will understand how relevant was this attempt to deactivate the Torah. Usually, the translation of Paul will even say destruction, abolition, evacuation, but the term is interesting because it contains, in some way, our term ergon. Paul employs the verb katargeo, which means making argos. Argos is negative alpha, primitive alpha, ergon. Making inoperative. Ergon is a word, making inoperative, disactivate. So what the Messiah does with respect to the law, he will make the law inoperative. So the translation destroy, abolish is too strong. It's a different thing. The law in some way is kept, but made argos, inoperative. No more in work, no more operative. So it has to do with the energy. It is no more energy. So there is this passage in which Paul shows how the coming of Messiah, making inoperative the law, free us from the law. Made us free from the law, from the letter of the law. I'll just quote first passage, then the other which you can more attentively command. What shall we say? That is criticizing the law. What shall we say? That the law is a sin? No. But I would not have known the sin if law was not there. I would have ignored desire if law would not have said, you must not desire. Then sin, in this way, through the commandment, has produced in me all kind of desire. Because without the law, the sin would not have been effective. But when the commandment came, sin became alive. And for me, this meant death. Sin grasp the impulsion through the commandment and seduce me and kill me. So you see how strong here is the critique of the law. It is the law. This law is not the sin, but law in some way has produced the sin, because commanding you shall not desire, this make me desire. So it's like sin in this way became alive, and for me this meant death. So what Paul is saying, the effect of the commandment of the law is to produce the desire which it prohibited. But then what we will see, this is the first effect of the law, but also then the commandment will divide the subject and separate potentiality from actuality. So let's read carefully this passage. We know, in doing this strong critique of the law, you must imagine that Paul has to be very careful, because he's doing something absolutely prohibited. So he must be careful to say, the law is not the sin, but it produced the sin. The law has good qualities, but nevertheless, so it cannot really, but speak freely. So we know that the law is spiritual, but I am a carnal man. Carnal, can we say? Sarcos. I am sold to the sin. And here begins this problem. I do not know what I act, what I do, what I put in the work. I do not do what I want. This is usually the translation I want, but here the verb is this verb telo, we saw, which just means I'm ready, I'm just prepared to do. So I do not do what I'm ready to do, what I could do in some way. But I do what I hate. If I do what I don't want to do, in that way, in some way, I recognize that law is good. But it's not me which acts. It is the sin which inhabits me, which is within me. I know that good does not dwell in me, in my flesh. Because, again, this image of Telaine, to will, to be ready to do, it is in my possibility, but to put into the act, no. So you see clearly, Paul is describing an experience in which something has divided in him possibility and acting. I do not do what I could do, what I'm ready to do. So the translation to will here is too strong, but you see the problem. And if I do what I don't want to do, I'm not ready to do. And being able to do is there, but to pass into the act, it's not there. This is not there. So what Paul is trying to describe here is that really the experience of a splitting between potentiality and actuality. He is no more able to put in the act what he could. He could say again, to get the possibility, it's near to me, I could, but then I'm no more able to put into the act, to pass to the act. if we should express this in Aristotelian term, this could be said saying, in this man, what he can and what he does are separated. Dunamis and energy do not communicate anymore. And the passage which follows, so Paul continues this description, this splitting, and he describes something that could be defined as the experience of double bind, as if this separation between potentiality and actuality could be translated into the fight between two opposite commandments. So I quote again, I do not realize the good that I would like, I could realize, and I do the evil that I would not like to do. I see in me this law. What I can do is evil. Nevertheless, deeply in me, I love the law of God. But in all my body, I discover another law, which fights against the law of God, the law of reason, and make me prisoner of the law of sin, which is in my body. So it translates this splitting between potentiality and actuality in the opposition between two laws, opposite laws, law of sin and law of God. When I try to compare in some way the experience Paul is describing, this division of the subject, within the subject of potentiality and actuality, when I compare in some way to Aristotle, it is not arbitrary, because Paul was Jewish, but he had a good Greek knowledge, Greek culture. Greek was his mother tongue. And there is a passage in Aristotle, in the Ethics of Aristotle, which is near to what he says when he says that it is the commandment who make him sin, who reveal the sin. I quote this passage from Aristotle because it's really interesting. If we posit the premise, the principle, all that is sweet must be tasted. Imagine this principle. All that is sweet must, this law, this commandment, all that is sweet must be tasted. It follows that the one who has the possibility, and it's not of doing of tasting, and it's not impeded, will taste. But if there is another commandment, another general proposition, which will prohibit to taste, and the other one which says all which is due sweet must be tasted, then the consequence will be that the desire will push you to taste, notwithstanding the prohibition. So this contrast, here Aristotle has the same image of two commandments which are opposed, and the result of this contradiction is that there will be a desire to taste. So it's very near to our passage of Paul. So what we really see here is not, as usually scholars says, the birth of the notion of will. What we see more precisely is that we have an experience of a splitting between potentiality and actuality, and then something as a will could be developed. But the first, what is describing is just a splitting between these two. But then we have the reading that Augustine makes of this passage. And there we see that he will interpret this passage as something concerning will. Augustine is a great theoretician of will. Usually scholars say he is the one who really invented the Christian conception of will. What Augustine will do in his commentary will be to shift the context from the sphere of potentiality to the sphere of will. What Augustine makes in the confession, as we call the confession, as we know, he described his own experience with the words taken by Paul. And he describes something similar. He's experiencing before the conversion the same drama that Paul is. So it's a famous passage we describes his travels before the conversion. And what he describes is that he thinks he wills something, that he is able to will something, but then he is never able to pass to the act, to realize this will. Potui velle et non facile. I could will, and nevertheless I could not act. Potui velle. You see already the connection between the modern verbs. Potui velle. I could will. Can we say I could will? I could will, but I could not act. Et non facile. But not to act. And what follows, what in the passage which follows, Augustine will interpret this experience, potui velle et non facile, I could will, but I could not act, as a fight between two wills. Wills, as the plural, two wills. So he, as you know, is a wonderful writer. He describes this interior fight experience as an horrible experience. He'll say, where this monster comes from, this monstrosity which I had to live, unde hoc monstrum, how is such a monster possible, and why? My soul commands to the body, but my body does not. My soul commands to the body, and then my body obeys. But if my soul commands to itself, it will not obey, it will resist. My soul commands that my hand moves, and this is made easily. But then why? When my soul commands to my soul to will, my soul commands that my soul should will, can we say this? Then why my soul does not obey? Where comes this monstruosity, and why? If I did not want to to command to will, I would not have commanded. But then why my soul does not obey? So you see, there is a commandment to will, and the soul refuses to will. While on the contrary, when the soul commands the hand to move, it moves. But if the soul commands to itself to will, the soul will not obey. Then he tries to explain this monstruosity. Why I experience in myself this monstruosity, that I cannot will what I will. Then it tries to explain is the reason is because I do not want entirely, and I do not command entirely. Because if he commands as far as he will, if he doesn't will do what he will, this means that in reality he does not will. The soul does not command fully. It is not identical with its commandment. The monstruosity is therefore a sickness, a disease of the soul, which on one side will, and on the other does not will. There are two wills. So he tries to explain this impossibility to command to soul to will as a contrast, as opposition between two wills. There are two wills. I think you can see the transformation. So what Paul is describing in terms of potentiality, here is translated entirely in terms of will. The contrast is a contrast between two wills. And the possibility is an impossibility to will. Not an usually they say that Christian, in Augustine, in Paul, Augustine, etc., the Christian subjectivity is divided. But then you have to precise that what is divided is not the consciousness. What is divided is a division between concerning will, potentiality. It's the context of this division is this one. And the root, the reason for that opposition between two wills is the fact that here we see that potentiality and actuality, man is divided from what it can. This is a very important point, that what often Deleuze comments has very good passage on this. One of the ways through which power acts on men is dividing them from what they can. So this is why the passage in Paul is interesting, because it exactly like that. What causes in Paul this splitting between potentiality and actuality is, as we saw, the commandment of the law. That's why it's a very interesting passage, because what Paul is saying, there is the commandment of the law, and the consequence of this commandment, that now I see that in myself I cannot do what I could do. And this is a very good description of the effect of the commandment. One of the first effects of the commandment of the law is to divide men from what they can. Of course, this can take the very banal form, this is prohibited. So it's a very banal way of separating yourself from what you can, because this you cannot do. But there are more complex, much more complex way. For instance, like Paul is describing, introducing yourself a division. If you interiorize the law, you will produce, the first effect will be a division within yourself. That's why the modern democratic citizen is completely divided, because it has interiorized and thinks he's commanding to himself. But nevertheless, this produces a problem. Then, by the way, just a digression, this problem of said Deleuze describes how power acts on men, dividing them from what they can do. But also, there's another important thing. Often today, power divides you not from potentiality, what you can do, but divides you from your impotentiality, from what you cannot do. Because one of the current idea that power today spreads everywhere is that you can do everything. You are able to do everything. This we can do this. And so we have the modern subject which loses the experience of its impotentiality. The modern subject thinks, I could do this, I could become an artist, I can do this, can I? So loses the experience of what he cannot do, which is the other side of Aristotle's potentiality. Every potentiality is an potentiality. And this is important. You must make the experience of what you can, but also the experience of what you cannot. If you lose this experience of your impotentiality, this is a very subtle way through which power again splits you, impedes you from what you can do. Because the capability of not doing is equally important as the capability of doing. So you must know what you cannot do and know what you can do. So the power acts in two ways, separating you from your potentiality, what you can do, but also separating you from what you can do. You lose, because also the potentiality not to do, also your potentiality is something that you must master, that you can be able to master. It's important to be master of our potentiality. But in that way you lose this possibility. You are no more able to know and master your potentiality. So that's another way of when you say people say I can, I doubt. So, but what we saw in these two passages, Paul and Augustine, is that we see the problem of will arise from a division of potentiality, from a crisis, from a dramatic experience of the separation between what I can and what I do. As Paul is described. And it's interesting that while in Paul terms it is like that, it's a division from what I can and what I do, in Augustine it is described as a fight between two wills. No more potentiality and actuality, but two wills are in myself. The one who commands the will and the other which but that doesn't resist to this. the will always is linked to a problem concerning potentiality. It's a way of transforming or coping with a problem of potentiality, transforming a problem of potentiality in a problem of will. So instead of asking why I cannot, the problem becomes why I will not. It's a problem. That's why you should read the passage between old men and modern men. Ancient men will pose the problem why I cannot. I cannot. Modern men will why I will not. But the problem does not become at all more clear. That was when I said that they tend to explain can through will. It's an explanation of a problem obscure with another even more obscure. Because what does it mean that I can? What it means that I will not. Why I cannot will? It's even more obscure. The notion of will is even more obscure than the notion of potential. Okay, do you have any question about? We can discuss a little. Yes.
Seems I'm just wondering where the later, I think about two or three centuries later, after Paul, the Manichaeans.
Pardon?
The Manichaeans who developed a concept of a schism between the mind and the body. And it seems that they were saying the opposite.
The Manichaeans. Oh, okay.
Manichaeans of what Paul is saying. Mm-hmm. That Paul is saying that he can will his body to move, but he can't will his soul to act the way it should. Whereas the Manichaeans are saying that they can will the soul to love God and not sin, but they can't will the body to do that, so they're going to divorce themselves from the body through self-mortification and other forms of it. Does the Manichaean concept of the schism between the mind and the body develop from Paul's letter to the Romans?
It's not only the Manichaean. The Manichaean perhaps were a little, perhaps not dependent on Paul, but instead of saying the Manichaeans, you could have said the Gnostics, because this problem of the opposition between evil and good, body and soul. I mean, the emphasis on this split, even thinking a good God and a bad God, defines also the Gnostic. And these were, of course, there at the moment of Paul.
I do mean the Gnostics as well. I do mean the Gnostics as well. The Gnostics and the Manichaeans.
But in this perspective, Manichaeans and Gnostics are quite the same. You know? And the Gnostics, of course, were around the same moment and the same place where Christianity begins. So in this way, probably there was a connection. Manichaeans perhaps not, because I don't know if they knew Paul. but the exasperation of the opposition, you know, which we find in the Gnostic, complete to push to the extreme this division.
I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on Deleuze's his book on Nietzsche, where the Nietzschean conception of being, he says being equals hierarchy. And ecce homo, being is hierarchy for Nietzsche, is what Deleuze says. And then in ecce homo, Nietzsche also does advocate, it's not mentioned very much, but he does discuss hierarchy of capacities. So it's not just a question of potency and impotence, but hierarchy. So have you thought of where hierarchy might fit?
First of all, you know the etymology of a hierarchy? Go back to our problem of commandment. The hierarchy, hieros arche, means sacred commandment.
sacred power. Then, this term, as you probably know, was invented by this strange guy, mystic, pseudo-Dionysus, someone who presents himself as being a follower of Paul, but it comes 6th century after. It's a false book. So he invented this idea of, he wrote a book called The Heavenly Hierarchy, meaning the heavenly sacred power, but in that book he developed the idea that the sacred power is hierarchical in modern sense. You have the Trinity, which is a very hierarchy, then you have the angels. He invented, is the one who invented all the 9 degrees of angels, seraphims, etc., etc. So he developed this idea of, not just that to say that hierarchy, the concept of hierarchy again contains the commandment, and this is what I mentioned before. That's very important that Nietzsche says will is commandment, because then you understand better what he means. Also when you see the will of power, will to power. And so when perhaps here is speaking of a hierarchy, but perhaps he implies that every hierarchy contains a commandment. So there are...
Sorry, I'm not very familiar with Christian theology, so maybe it's a simple question. Paul says that I come from Jewish background, but not practicing. Paul says that there is he can command his body and he cannot command his soul, but it seems that Paul is divided into 3 then, not only into 2. Because he can command the soul and command the body, so it's neither one nor the other.
More precisely, it's Augustine that says what you say. Augustine says that the soul can command the body. Paul just says there is a division between I can do, but I can, but I cannot do. While Augustine makes this. Why do you say 3? There is always a principle which commands, which is the soul. Then the body obeys, while the soul does not obey to itself. So the division is in the soul and not between soul and body.
So there's a division between soul and body, and there's a division in the soul itself.
But the division between soul and body is not relevant because body obeys to soul. When I command my hand to take this, my hand doesn't. When I command to my soul to will, it will resist. It will not obey. It's a division within the soul. But it's interpreted as the division, as the presence in the soul of 2 contrary wills. It's the strange idea that one can have in the soul's 2 contrary wills. It's very familiar to modern, but then this became very familiar. We are very familiar with the idea that we have 2 contrary desires, 2 contrary will, etc. But there we see this idea arising.
I think we can see very clearly where this problem begins to be addressed in the technical manuals on spiritual warfare that come up, and also in the hagiographies. For example, the Vita Sancti Antoniae of Athanasius is clearly a practical manual for the identification of the tricks, the ruses, of the devil. And so that practical manual and the necessity for those kinds of techniques indicates also a kind of obscurity in that division within the soul, that you need to have a way to see that, to determine, to judge and to practice from which division a directive will become actuated.
Right. What we see, it is as if in that moment, let's say the first centuries of Christian event, it is as if
what is going on is a great transformation, anthropological transformation of man, which takes the form of a crisis and interior division, which we do not find in classical. For instance, the tragic contrast in the tragic hero is not a contrast of an interior splitting of will, not at all. It's a construct of two opposite principles. Antigone sees as his duty to give sepulture to give a grave, while this is prohibited from the law, and that we have a contrast between it's not an interior concept, it's an objective contrast, a tragic concept. But in modernity is interiorized the drama, the contrast, and we see a kind of a spiritual, psychological catastrophe. I say this because when you read in this moment the monastic movement also begins. People begins to escape from the world. There is a huge phenomenon of the monasticism. Monasticism. The monastery begins, etc. And then you have the lot of book instruction to the monks how to cope with this drama. You will have the scene, but it always takes the form of an interior division. So the Christian subjectivity, especially in the moment of its formation, also now, but in the beginning it's clear, it's a completely divided man. And this takes the form of the contrast between sin and etc. But also the form of your will is divided. But for instance, we have this marvelous description of the 7 vices. So many of these instructions for the monks have the form of a description of the vices that threatens you. And one of the most terrible is the Arcadia, the Meridian devil. And when they describe, can you say in English?
Acedia, sloth, laziness.
Yeah, it's not lazy, it's what's complex. It's that the monk is no more able again to do anything he seems to want. I know that now it's the moment I have to read the book of soul, but I take the book and the books fall from my hand. I can't do what I should do again. And these are very long descriptions. So really there is the formation of modern subjectivity is done through a profound and deep experience of a division, of a dramatic splitting, which is completely ignored by the ancient men. They don't have these problems. They do not need Freud.
It's very curious that in one of the earliest formulations of the problem of the 7 deadly sins, there were 8, and it was Evagrius Ponticus who had made a division between acedia, spiritual sloth and material sloth, the sloth of the body, the laziness, but the inapplicability of the body. And it very quickly, by the time of Cassian and others, it very quickly had become one sin of acedia.
It's almost, sometimes called in Latin tristizia, sadness, because it takes the form of the people who have experienced sad, for deep sadness. It's a kind of depression. Today we call this depression. Yes?
I wonder if we could come back to Gabriel's point about the number 3, because of course we know with the Trinity in Christian theology that's a huge number. And I wondered if we could relate it at all to, so God the Father is the divine or the Word, God the Son is the flesh or the body, and God the Spirit is perhaps the will. And so it seems to map or correspond somewhat to this question of commandment, tying the person to someone else through the law. So the law, in a sense, is a kind of correspondence to God the Father or the Word, perhaps. Just was responding to God.
You don't know how right it is. Because perhaps one of the greatest achievements of Augustine is, perhaps someone of you have read the Confessions, you know, is the attempt to translate the Trinity into an interior, the shape of the interior of man. And it takes the form of man, will. So it is trying to translate the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, to translate it in human faculties. And will is central. But the will is not the Spirit, the will is more the Son. The Son is also the manifestation of the will of the Father. That's why it's called the Word, the Verb, no? Because you have the Father, and then the will is embodied in the Son. The will and Word, manifestation. Here you see a very important thing. It is the relation between theology and psychology. Our psychological concepts are often theological concepts interiorized. And in Augustine, this is clear. So it's trying to do the Son is the will, God is the memory. No, not perhaps exactly. But this is more general. It is, for instance, if we go back in the past, so we see that, for instance, love in the beginning was a god. As you know, no? Eros. Greek is first a god. First of all, is a god, a real person. No? Then it becomes an experience, a psychological experience. So it's, I mean, there is a process in the history of humanity going from theology to psychology. So something is first thought on the plane of theology, gods. So now it's a god. Then it becomes, it's interiorized, it becomes a question.
But it can be thought the other way around. No? There is, for example, there would be love, and love is exteriorized in the image of the
No,
God.
it's not true, because the document we have, it's the contrary. We have no document saying before that. If we had some documents describing love, and then, no, if we go really back, the most ancient text, God is love. Love is a God. Of course, there is always already a terms. In some way, you're right, but then they tend to, of course, they also experience the love, but they tend to represent this, to conceive this as God. Then, after, on the contrary, we tend to forget this and think only in terms of psychology. We should be aware that when we speak in terms of psychology, we are manipulating hidden theological concepts. And will is a clear, because what we are going to see, that perhaps the central concept in Christian theology is will. We will see to this afternoon. All the theology is built on the Christian theology is built on the concept of will. Then, of course, we will have a modern subjectivity, free subject who wills, is free to will, etc. But this, again, is a secularization of something that was thought for God, the will of God. God is essentially will. Yes.
I'm wondering how does the notion of gift relate?
Gift.
Gift, especially in relation to potentiality, and when
gift as the act of giving, or gift as a quality.
Say when he is in possession of a certain gift, we believe he is in possession of a gift. But this also introduces the hierarchy of titles. I'm wondering when.
But do you mean that if we conceive a faculty, a capability, a potentiality as a gift, this implies that someone has given it?
It's a question. Because it's something to say, gift, that somebody uses to describe the particular potentiality or.
The good thing I can see in the idea of gift is that in that way potentiality is not referred to subjectivity. So it's not the I who is possessed with this potentiality. It's a gift. It's something that does not depend. But it's just a way to present it.
I had a question that might tie in with this idea of the gift that goes back to Aristotle and the object that contains within it its potentiality. I'm wondering what happens upon the moment of encounter when that object is taken in or received and the potentiality is processed. If this might tie in with the idea of a gift, or if you might be able to say something about it.
I don't quite see the point, because what we said this thing that for the Greek, the desirable is what makes me desire. It's not the reverse. It's not that I, the subject, am the origin of my desire of the object. I don't get the point. What was it, your question exactly?
I'm wondering more about what happens when you have this encounter, when this object that has the potentiality in it is, if we're not talking about subjectivity or not talking about receiving as a subject, what exactly?
What do you mean by an object which has the potentiality?
With what we were saying before, with Aristotle, that a great work shows the potentiality is still there in it.
This is not Aristotle, it's it's me. Yeah. Yeah, but then I would say that what happened, because this concerns the work, which is the result end of potentiality. And what I'm saying, potentiality does not exhaust itself in the work, but should be still alive. Otherwise, if potentiality was completely exhausted in the work, in some way the work is dead, something no more alive. So the idea here, the potentiality is still in the act. It's not something which is only before. It's still in the act, and even perhaps after. I would say that the capability, it's the contrary. Usually we tend to represent possibility as something coming before actuality. I have a possibility, then I realize it. I think we should perhaps reverse the problem and thinking possibility as something which comes after actuality. Why say that? Because we are always in a certain reality. We are always confronted with facts, realities, real facts. And even power today has also this tendency, this is the reality, these are the facts. You have to cope with this fact. And what happens is that you must here have the ability of transforming these facts into possibilities, to give back potentialities to actualities. This, the act of thinking is nothing else than this. The capability, when you are confronted with fact, either you are completely destroyed, you cannot make nothing, no. Either you are able to open a possibility, to give back possibility, because it's not true
there is no fact which does not contain possibility. You don't see it. Usually we don't see the possibility. It's just a fact, there is nothing to do. The ability of thinking is the capability of giving back possibility. In that case, the possibility comes after. It's something which is after the action. It's more interesting because the possibility before, yes, but the possibility after is much more interesting. Transform, and it's the art of living. The art of living is, of course, the capability of making your life possible. People usually make their life impossible, but you must be able to make your life possible. This means to give back possibility to the facts, to the situation, the reality in which you are necessarily taken, captured. Sorry, just what I'd answer. And for instance, what they call it today, political problems are presented as if they will not contain any possibility. So the only possibility is the fact is this. Now you want this or you don't want. No, it's not true. There is a third. There is a possibility. I can see that the problem as containing a possibility, not as the choice between two facts. Information is today like that. What the media do is they just present facts, no possibility. And on the contrary, we must read these facts. Okay, these are the facts. Now, let's transform them in possibilities. This is always excluded. No, it's not like that. It's only the choice between two facts. Sorry, what were you saying?
I was just going to ask about the concept of latency, of something that is hidden in the object itself. Is potentiality a way to extract that latency, which is already there? It's something that is, for example, I'm thinking of going back to art, Michelangelo's last sculptures, where there's a latency in them that hasn't been realized, and there's a potential of the artist or the sculptor to reveal that which is latent, which is hidden. Is that a third term that we could maybe introduce, or is not pertinent?
No, if you made the example of Michelangelo, I see two instances in Michelangelo of this problem. First, as you know, for instance, in the sculptures of the Sacrestia Nova in Florence, he had this idea of consciously leaving unfinished sculpture. You know, they are left unfinished. So they are not unfinished. They are voluntarily left unfinished, and this keeps this idea of potentiality. So when you see a work that seems unfinished, of course it's playing with potentiality and actuality, because you have the idea, should this be continued, finished? But on the contrary, it was finitely unfinished, it was willingly unfinished, so it is finished. But it gives you the idea of unfinished. No? So it's a very interesting idea. He played with this. It was perhaps the first. Really, then it has to be done after. So this idea of the unfinished is very interesting. It relates to potentiality, because then you see that there is still potentiality in this work. And the other, it was the idea he gave us in the poem that a single marble contains all the works, an infinity of works. There is this beautiful poem. There is no idea in the mind of the artist that the marble does not contain again. So the marble contains all the potentialities, all the ideas that the mind of an artist can conceive is in the marble. And that's why that creation becomes the elimination of certain possibility. Otherwise, I don't know. Otherwise, you could say that, I don't know if you meant this, but in some way, potentiality is latent in the world. It's there, you must have the ability to recognize it. It's in latency.
I don't know in which direction, but if it is actually almost like an object that it's used.
Yeah, yeah. This that you are now saying, absolutely, that's the kind it is used, the idea of sin, strongly used in order to, some way, even form, shape the scientific of the moment, for instance. So the idea of temptation. Again, temptation is another great way of shaping a personality. You got tapped. It's also a new thing that does not exist for a Greek that I'm tapped. By what?
Just an observation, not a question. You mentioned that this notion of the will is based on Christian theology and tradition in a number of religions, in Buddhism, a number of religions based in India. The notion of the will is viewed as something, as a weakness that needs to be surpassed. Your life is meant to surpass the will because the will is a weakness imposing itself on your life.
Yeah, this is a great distinction between that is, Christianity is grounded on will, also because Christianity demands a free subject, and a free subject means a subject who will be responsible for his actions. And will, we'll see, is a way to attribute, assign action to a subject. You willed this, so this, you are responsible for this act. So it's a kind of a device for attributing responsibility. While these other religions are completely in another sphere, so no will at all. Man must be something which has nothing to do, which must be free himself from will. It's what Schopenhauer took from Buddhism.
Well, you mentioned historical a priori in the first session.
What?
Historical a priori.
A priori.
A priori in the first session. It seems to me it's like a precondition for extracting potential from the history, which has suppressed many things before it happened. So would you make that connection of will to the historical a priori?
I don't know, but what you said is true. I mean, also when you make an historical investigation, if you have not the capability of extracting possibilities from the fact, because history is a series of facts. You have documents, facts. If you just take them as pure actuality with no possibility in them, how can you write an history? I mean, it's just a series of facts. So the historian, the good historian, must also have the ability of finding possibility into the past, which is incredible, no? Because for usually the past is what is no more possible. No? In the past there are no possibilities. But then Benjamin has a wonderful image, says something really wonderful. He says, what is memory? What is to, what's the word? Remember. What is remembering? Remembering is giving back possibility to the past. When you really remember something, and he was thinking to what Proust calls the involuntary memories. Suddenly a memory appears in your mind, force, with force, etc. This means that the past is again possible. And memory, according to Benjamin, is the faculty to give back possibility to the past. And in this sense, it's linked to the work of the historian. Because the historian has to do with the memory, with the past. But an historian which is not able to give back possibility to the past and just lists a series of things is not interesting, it's not interesting. So, I mean, this is true for history in the public sense, history of the collective sense of mankind, but it's true in the personal history. So if we are not able to give back possibility to our past, our life is really doomed to a sad necessity, no? Because the chain of the facts will enslave you. But if you are able to see your past as possible, not your future, your past as possible, then you will be able, that's real freedom. He wants to perhaps go to say something.
I wanted to, yours is really, you can go first, but I wanted to go back quickly to what Tom was saying about what Tom mentioned about a great work of art being one that, well, you mentioned as well, that it was contains its potential after it's finished. And then Tom had said that if you have a work consisting of the movement of potentiality conclusion, that it reemerges in film photography, like with leaving this evidentiary trace then of the passage, and then you defer the potentiality. And so I was wondering, because I hadn't really thought about, is it an example of like that not happening then, if it's deferral of potentiality, of like say with Michel Haneke in his rendition of Kafka's The Castle, where it's at the very, very end, it just sort of cuts off and says, here ends the text, as opposed to trying to like glue together some sort of narrative in it, which is a little bit more closer to what Orson Welles did with The Trial, kind of, where it kind of floats along more. So I was wondering if that's an example of film doing that where the potential is not deferred, and maybe some other just examples of that playing out with film in a way that didn't defer the potentiality. I was just curious.
I didn't see the film you mentioned, but one important thing that we already mentioned, this is if there is a transformation in the field of art, in modernity, contemporary, starting from 20th century, the big transformation could be described as, while we could say before, in this field of art, the work had the primacy, and the creative process, the potentiality, etc., was in the shadow. What happens in the 20th century is that the work goes in the shadow, and the creative process, the artist, the potentialities, the process of how did the work was created, etc., comes to the light and takes the primacy. This is a strange reversal, but it's the avant-garde is just that. The 20th century avant-garde is just the attempt to establish a primacy of the creative process on the work. The work becomes secondary. It even does not exist anymore as in the ready-made. Duchamp ready-made. There is no work, of course. But in this curious transition of an object from the sphere of the tool to the sphere of the museum, something appears which is no more a work, which is just an act of the artist, or the man who did this, the process. So this is important to understand what happened in contemporary art. So, the decline of work and the primacy of the creative process. That's why then an artist can play on this, like Thomas suggested, can now play with the creative process, try to document the process so that the work does not count anymore. Often the work is absent.
It's even the case.
Performance, there is no more work.
It's even the case exactly as you suggest, when that documentation is something which exists outside and not part of the work. So that, for example, Duchamp, who designates a snow shovel, one among many, because a rack of snow shovels, all for the most part pretty much the same, but it's this one that becomes in advance of the broken arm. It's deferred because the shovel itself, I believe, was lost, and so you have a photograph. But that very act of designation, when you ask, why this one and not the one next to it, because we can't tell the difference. It is, for all intents and purposes, a negligible difference. Why this one and that? It absolutely establishes the primacy of the act of designation as the creative disposition.
Following up on these two comments, I would say that we also think that in terms of what you described as a modern socio-political condition of insisting that only potentiality, of only being able to do and that you can do everything is primary, that in fact this shift from the work being first and the process being second to the primacy of the process being given is actually a way to deal with the potential of being inoperative or impotential, in the sense that one must remind oneself that although everything is telling you that you can do, that you can do, that you can do, it's because actually what's most dangerous to this entire system is to not do. And to know your inability to not do and what you cannot do is a form of doing that fits in no way in a system that is completely fixated on utility. And that actually the process of what transforms the ready-made into a work is important in the sense that this manufactured object, which is part of an industrial mechanism, is actually taken out of work and made inoperative. So it's not so clear to say that it is not a work, it is maybe perhaps more of a comment on the notion of what constitutes work, whether it's useful or useless work. And I think that's important.
Yeah, I would just add that I think that's a great point, Ashkan, that there's actually an action of repotentializing processes, objects, etc., that the artist participates in, which is to say to recognize impotentialities, potentialities, and actualizations that really opens up all of those possibilities in a way that wasn't available before. And I think it's a very powerful act, perhaps. I mean, it can dissolve and go into other areas, but I do also, I thank you for the comment.
In Duchamp, there is an operation of potentiality, which underlines potentiality. And necessarily, that's why I say that it decline the work, because this necessarily will be, there will be a primacy of potentiality on the work. But then, when, after Duchamp, what we see today, the retake of this experience, and this is something that we can repeat. Duchamp gesture cannot be repeated, because otherwise, while, as you said, there is an experience of Duchamp there, if you repeat them and try to present this as a video work of art, then you lose precisely the experience of potentiality. So when today contemporary art, generalized, but if the procedure is that only potentiality is the creative process, the creative potentiality is there
presented in a way is substituting the word. What gets lost paradoxically is precisely the experience of potentiality and potentiality. While in the Duchamp is also there.
That's also related to this professionalization also in general fields, that also the artist's professional quality is perhaps identified by his process of being an artist, which actually creates a pure potentiality to his just saying, well, I'm an artist and that's enough. In a sense, and that's where these kind of dangers come in.
Yeah, Duchamp invented the ready-made work. They were the ready-made artists. I take a man, I put in the museum, and we are all ready-made artists, of course, in this sense.
2 points to follow. No, 2 points to follow on this excellent thread. It's why it's important that the snow shovel, the urinal, the bicycle wheel, the bottle rack are lost. The original instances of those are all lost. So Duchamp himself partakes in a kind of portent of that modernity by problematizing that. He does it another way with the large glass, which is installed very precisely in the Museum of Philadelphia, but during his lifetime had brought about the fabrication of 3 replications of the large glass, and after his death, 2 more.
It is nonsense to pretend that there is original ready-made.
Absolutely, completely nonsensical.
Original.
And then the repetitions underscore that pretense. And so the final point, so then it underscores the poverty of a current fascination in contemporary art with reenactment, rehearsal, recuperation, all of these things. Exactly so. There is no original.
Actually, that goes to what you said that the problem is to do. The problem is not to do. It's another form. Because there's no security of communication.
When I spoke about usage of formal life, it's not at all something which concerns interiority. On the contrary, something really exterior. The form of your life, or the way you use your habits, your uses. So in this way, it's not interiorized. And the first question concerning the reform, the reform, of course, interiorized a lot. You know that the Jewish says always that Christianism is just an interiorization of certain Jewish concept, and then Catholic reform can be seen as an interiorization of certain Catholic conception, etc., etc. So there is this process of interiorization. In general, I prefer the exteriority. So I prefer Catholic Church to Reformed Church. It's better. It's there. It's a perfect exterior. We have this liturgy thing, paintings, etc. More clear. It's clear. While the Reform, that's why the Reform was what contributed more to modernity, because they have this idea of interior, free will, etc. Catholicism has a kind of pagan remnants, which is more interesting. What about Islam? What about Iran? Do you count according to the Hijra? No, in Islamic.
Well, the Iranian calendar is a solar calendar.
Is it?
It's a solar calendar, so it actually is not coinciding with the Islamic calendar, which is.
It's different from the Hijra.
Yeah, I mean the Iranian calendar is also based on the start of the Hijra, but according to the solar calendar and not the lunar. So it's actually like almost 100 years behind the Islamic lunar calendar. In Iran, it's, Zoya, what's the year now? 1390? 1390. And, but in Arab countries, it's 1420.
Shall we stop on chronology?